So without further ado, if you all will welcome Amy, our moderator, and our esteemed panel.
Thank you for that. So we're going to just jump right in and get started because I know we have a lot to cover. As we were prepping for this panel, we realized that we all had a lot to say about this topic. So one of the themes that emerged, well, there's several themes, so you'll kind of know where we're going with this conversation. One was the pace of change that has really hit the market and how fast things are moving. The engagement of providers and of really the C-suite level and how to get everyone kind of on the same ship and moving in the same direction. And then the idea of risk, how much risk, when to take on risk, when to jump into risk, and how to manage it. So those are kind of some overarching themes of where this conversation is going to go. So I have some prepared questions that we're going to ask our panel, but be thinking about some questions that you might want to get up and ask them as well. So we're going to start out talking about how, the idea of engagement and how to engage your C-suite, but also their providers on the ground in the idea of these alternative payment models and how to get them working in the same direction. And then as we were prepping, someone also had kind of the sub-question of, does it really matter if you are working in an employed situation or if you are really working with more community-based providers? So let's talk a little bit about the engagement in alternative payment models, both at the C-suite level and at the provider level. So who wants to go first? Or I'll call on someone.
I'm happy to go.
Okay.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Dev Sangha. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. When we were planning for this panel, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is that when you make decisions in healthcare, you want a tremendous amount of data, you want a tremendous amount of reassurance, and this value-based space, you have to take a little bit of leap in admitting that you're going to go in this direction. So when we think about at Duke Health, how do you want to get individuals engaged? On the C-suite side, you really need to have a credible argument around finance. It's often the opposite. It's not about how much margin you're going to make, but how much margin you might not lose. It's a little different way of thinking. I think when you're thinking with the provider community, I really look at it two ways. Fundamentally, doing this kind of work really requires providers to change the way they deliver healthcare. Sometimes we use the term changing provider behavior, and behavior is a little bit of a loaded term, but I'll use it understanding that there's no other substitute for the word. So it's really about how do you change provider behavior, and I like to look at it in two different ways. One is you got to get providers to do something, and then the other is you got to get providers to stop doing something. And on the doing something, it's typically adding something to workflow. So it's really convincing providers to add something to their workflow, which means you sometimes have to take something away from their workflow. And then for that latter half, how do you get providers to stop doing something? That's the real challenging piece, because it oftentimes gets into provider autonomy, standard of practice, the way providers are trained, and of course compensation models. So when you think about this globally, I think when you enter into these type of arrangements, or you're thinking about an APM, you really got to go top down and bottom up to really find that safe space to play that's not going to break the bank, but it's actually going to improve your fund of understanding.
I'll go next. And so UNC Health Alliance, just to set a little bit of context, is UNC Healthcare's clinically integrated network and population health services organization. And within the 100 counties in North Carolina, UNC Health Alliance spans 48 counties, 11 hospitals, 5,000 providers, and about 1,800 of those are independently affiliated with us. And it's really important for us to collaborate with independent practices. We want them to remain independent, and we want to jointly collaborate to improve the health of our patients, but also assume increased levels of financial responsibility, accountability, and managing total cost and quality. We started our SIN 4 years ago, although our first performance year was 3 years ago with NextGen ACO. Before that, UNC invested in population health for several years, had our chief value officer role, and I would say in terms of thinking about C-suite and level of commitment, they're absolutely committed to this, although when I joined in October 2016, just 3 months prior to going live with NextGen, I heard the NextGen referred to as a little bit of an experiment. Fast forward 3 years, and this is no longer an experiment. This is absolutely the path that we're on. Since NextGen, we've signed on with commercial contracts, and I like to think that, the C-suite is engaged because it's the right thing to do, and of course that is the case, but there's also a lot of pressure within the state of North Carolina. And some of you may have read the Health Affairs article that was published recently. We've got managed Medicaid coming to North Carolina. We've got Blue Cross Blue Shield introducing Blue Premier, which is an APM construct. 5 systems have signed on to that. Combined between Blue Cross and DHHS, they govern about 2/3 of payments. We had the state treasurer for the state health plan try to introduce reference-based pricing. We've got a lot of venture-based companies coming into North Carolina, setting up shop, and really viewing hospitals as more of a cost center. And so when you look at all these competitive dynamics, part of UNC Health Alliance is, yes, it's the right thing to do, but it's also a little bit responding to market dynamic. And all of these market dynamics are incredibly helpful because it is accelerating the pace. I think this morning we were talking about why is it taking so long, and it is taking a long time, but in the state of North Carolina, we see a lot of momentum. The other piece to note in terms of getting buy-in from our C-suite is, think about North Carolina. In the center of North Carolina, there's a Research Triangle Park, right? And that's kind of where a lot of the population resides, and it's a growth market. We have people moving in that are retirees. Every time I'm on I-40, I notice that year after year, right? So the traffic increasing. We've got an aging population. So in a growth market, there's absolutely no excuse, right, for not going into value-based care, because there will always be people that need beds in hospitals. So the hospitalists, everyone has to wrap their mind around that this is not only the right thing to do, but it's the right time to do it. And then lastly, in terms of the actual workforce, we jumped into NextGen ACO without any experience in Pioneer, MSSP. It's kind of akin to jumping off of the high dive. And we did that by design to win hearts and minds. Instead of going really narrow and focusing on, say, skilled nursing costs, we decided to go broad, focusing on 4 work streams. So what do we do with ED transitions, 24/7 access to care, our ambulatory space, and the post-acute, including everything from home health, palliative care, hospice, et cetera. It's taken a lot of work. It's really serving as infrastructure for all of our other value-based contracts.
I'll go next. We'll just go down the line.
Works.
So Derek Novak, thank you for having me this morning, from Iowa. So we get visited every 4 years, and I got reminded of that flying with some politicians this morning. But why I say about Iowa is it's one of those states where we don't have a lot of growth. And so relatively new to this role, still using the new card even a year in. However, been with our ACO and our PHSO since we started in 2012. And I say all that background just for a little bit of context of over the last year in educating our C-suite of why we do this work. We started out more so as a pet project, and that pet project lasted 7 years. And really, when we got into this position now, is understanding where everyone's at. So we had a lot of kind of the old adage of a readmission prevented. Necessarily, we're taking money out of the hospital side. We're a health system, so that's obviously important in terms of where we get our revenue. However, as we looked at it and we started to really bring the C-suite along is, well, how much is our margin on that particular service? And not a growing state, as well as the bottom 5 in terms of Medicare reimbursement, we're really forced into this world around how do we reinvent our organization and be more focused on that outpatient setting, which is obviously complementary to value-based. So a lot of our engagement, the C-suite, is just really sitting down and understanding their lens of how they see the world, and also trying to bring them along is educating them around, well, how does the value-based actually impact their bottom line, as well as ultimately improve outcomes for our patients, which is what we're there for. So a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, and really just sitting down and having frank conversations.
And I'll finish off since I'm at the end of the table here. And I agree with everything that's been said. I'm Jerry from FusionFive, and unlike the other participants here who you can probably are familiar with what they do, FusionFive is an organization that sits as kind of a hybrid between a management services organization and a administrative services organization to help providers of all types navigate the value-based healthcare landscape and all of the models that are coming out. We tend to be agnostic about where we can identify savings, improve care, can generate positive outcomes, because our approach is really global and holistic. You know, I agree with the bottom-up, top-down variety of looking at how do you interact with people in terms of getting an understanding of value-based care and where they should be. It's important, and the term came up about behavior change, and it's one that we've used. I've used this in the past. But it's really about mindset change when you think about providers and the administrators. It's can you get them out of the fee-for-service mentality that they're in to move into something that is not fee-for-service. I tend to stay away from using value-based in that term because if we heard the very first presentations, the question was, what does value-based care really mean? And the definition is different to different people. And that's somewhat unfortunate because it should be unified and it's not. We talked about the pace of change, and I hope you can indulge me for something. If I was giving a presentation up here, I have a couple of slides I would normally do this with. But the pace of change and barriers to understanding how to interact on value-based care initiatives and models is really important. And so I would normally show a picture of Fifth Avenue in New York in 1900. And the image would show you a lot of fuzzy vehicles moving down Fifth Avenue, most of which were horse-drawn carriages, which was the big thing at the time, right? Horses were everything. Everyone should invest in horses. They've been around for a century. They're going to be around forever. But if you look really carefully at that particular picture in 1900, there is one combustion engine vehicle going down the street, obviously built by Ford. If you show that same picture of Fifth Avenue in 1913, you will see all combustion engine vehicles and one horse-drawn carriage. And so the pace can actually be very rapid on change. I was just at the Accountable Care Learning Consortium, which last week here in DC, which is an organization put together by former Utah Governor and HHS Secretary Mike Leavitt. And the conversation that he usually has is the change that occurs in healthcare is approximately a 40-year cycle, and he believes that we're about in year 25 of a 40-year cycle. And so the biggest portion of the change will happen from now towards the end, that last 15 years. And so what are the barriers you have to overcome? We've heard a lot of the barriers today, but what we haven't heard is the barriers that are yourselves. And that's a major hurdle. It's the acceptance that change happens and the pace that change happens. But I'd like to do just a little bit of an audience participation, if you will. I'm an ex-med school professor, so this is always part of what we do. I'd like you to look at your neighbor sitting next to you. You may not know who they are. You probably introduced yourself. And for 15 seconds, ask the person next to you, what color is a yield sign? I'm serious. Work on this, because we're going to do a hand-raising thing. All right, so we'll stop there because I know we want to get to questions. I'd like you to raise your hands and say how many people said yellow and black. Okay, usually it's about half the audience, so there's probably a few who haven't said that but don't want to raise their hands. Of those, who said yellow or black? Keep your hands up there. How many of you are 40 or younger? It's great. Yield signs are red and white. They changed in 1971. And if you said yellow and black and you're less than 40, you've never seen a yellow and black yield sign. The same thing, this very same thing happens in healthcare in that you have your own perceptions of change and what is possible, and you have to get over those in order to move forward.
That is fascinating. So as we're changing and we're engaging in these contracts, when we were talking before, we talked about how everyone that has employed physicians says it's so much easier to do if you own your physicians and if you own all the clinics and you have this employed workforce because you can implement the change because you have the architecture built. And then you talk to someone else in a community-based program and they're like, it's so much easier with community-based physicians because they're not owned and they have their independence and they can do things a different way. And I think that everyone always thinks the grass is greener depending on the situation that they're in. Have you found different ways to engage different members of the workforce depending on their employment situation? Anyone? Yes.
I'll get us out of order here a little bit. So our provider network is about 1/4 employed, 3/4 independent, so affiliated or aligned. And we started off with just employed, so we've seen really the evolution of that model and really where we need to put, I guess, our efforts in terms of a provider engagement. And we're in the midst of that change yet again. I'm not sure where that is on the continuum, but what we've done historically is aligned our employed physician compensation to about 5% value-based, and we've aligned our independent compensation for this work, essentially whatever they produce they would receive, minus an overhead allocation. And where we've been with our board is really realizing that that doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because of that lag time from when programs are initiated to when they're actually reconciled. So most notably Medicare Advantage, where a majority of that revenue is 18 months after the fact. So it feels like they won the lottery when they receive that money. And so where our board is really focused today and openly with our provider groups is to say, what are the behaviors that we need in order to be successful in this program? And irregardless of our success in the program, we would actually pay out on those behaviors. So things like annual wellness visits, risk adjusting their incentive associated with their patient population, the network integrity so that we have line of sight on those patients and making sure that we're keeping their care coordinated throughout the system. So we're in the midst of that change now, and just those learnings over the last 7 years is really to look at how do we best decouple that performance and really set up a long-term sustainable program for our entire network.
I'll go next and add a little bit to this. From our perspective, being in BPCI as a significant convener in BPCI, we don't see a lot of difference in terms of dealing with the independent practitioner from a physician group practice perspective or an ACH with employed physicians. There's always the challenge of getting physician buy-in regardless of what it is. The hospital systems or the hospitals, depending on whether they're a system or individual, tend to react a little bit slower than the physician practices do. But it's really about communicating to the ultimate physicians for what that care redesign plan needs to be. In the world of ACOs, it tends to be a little bit different because it really depends on who the ACO is. In the case of yours at Unity Point, right? Or Mercy?
No,
Mercy.
Mercy.
Okay, it was one of those. We have most of the orthopods in your territory. It really is kind of who's in charge of the system, and there's always this ongoing battle, and I hope we have a question that deals with this later on, is the ongoing battle, and we've heard it before on ownership. Who owns the bundle? Who owns the model? And I think the question should be, is there a real owner? Should there be a real owner? And if so, how does that actually work? And so it's a matter of focusing on how best to deal with the physician components, regardless of whether they're employed or not.
You know, from UNC Health Alliance's perspective, there are a lot of differences between our employed physicians and our independently affiliated physicians. On the employed side, we've got a mix of faculty and community employed, and you know, their compensation differs, and so we have an initiative underway to reach alignment on that front. But we very much want them to be payer agnostic. You know, it was easy when we had one contract and it was next gen. Now we have several, and they don't want to spend time, and we don't want them to spend time thinking about payer-specific contracts. So when we think about employed, it's say more holistic. For independents, it's completely opposite. I mean, the independent practices absolutely think in terms of contracts. There are different flavors of independence. Some are pretty sophisticated in terms of the infrastructure that they have, their EMR and expected practices, et cetera. And then you have very small practices run by families, and a lot of them are just struggling to keep their doors open. And generally speaking, independents are more opportunistic. They need to be. On the employed side, there's kind of that safety of knowing you have your paycheck and you have, all this infrastructure that you can leverage, and that's not true for independents. They have to be or become incredibly savvy in terms of options out there. For our clinically integrated network, it's not exclusive, meaning, you're an independent and you can contract with whomever you want to contract with. We'd like you to contract with us because you see value in working with us, but we certainly don't force anyone to do that. And it has resulted in practices picking and choosing who they align with, and then the question becomes, well, how clinically integrated are you? Well, you've got practices that have a foot in many different systems and many different arrangements, and I think that's just something that we're all going to have to work through.
I would add that I agree with my co-panelists, but the one piece that I would add is that if you are coming at this from the perspective of a group of, if you will, independent providers versus aligned or owned providers, I think the first thing you need to know is what's the relationship between the two. And if you have a very collegial, collaborative relationship among the two camps, you can do this kind of work. If there are issues out there that are yet to be resolved, this is only going to magnify them. So if you're an academic medical center, access can sometimes be a challenge for independent community providers. And so if you're going to try to go out there and to recruit them and to participate in something like an ACO or CIN, you have to be prepared to uncover some of the other challenges that are out there. And then finding the common ground. I think we often use shared savings as the promise, but if you've got large groups with thousands of doctors, even millions of dollars of shared savings, once they actually get distributed, can be marginal depending on your distribution model. So we've actually learned that a better cause is actually efficiency. If you can convince providers, whether owned or aligned, that your work life will be made easier by these APMs or these VBC models, and you can actually do that, you'll get better engagement, I think, than the promise of a few hundred or a few $1,000s of shared savings. And I would imagine when you start to get into tens of thousands of dollars, maybe you get differences, but the efficiency argument is a much better one. And so efficiency in terms of getting quick access, getting quick follow-up, getting quick communication, working with one another, finding who's the best at doing something. One of the challenges when you're a part of a leading quaternary healthcare system is that you often find answers to very complicated things that other parts of the world can't. But this stuff isn't complicated. Many of you know that this stuff doesn't require Nobel laureates or other stuff. It really just requires people who have the ability to think differently. So one of the biggest areas that we've been able to be successful in our ACO is really looking at those community providers, the non-Duke providers, and what are they doing, and how can we translate what they do into our practice at Duke. And if you go into that kind of relationship genuinely, you actually kind of build that collaborative relationship, the collegiality and so forth. But in the absence of common ground, I don't think it matters if you're aligned or independent. You've got to find what gets you together in the first place.
Kind of building off the idea of alignment and standardization, when we have looked at our members at the AAFP, we have about 135,000 members, and we did a survey of them, and we asked them, how many payers do you deal with in your clinic? And roughly 60% of them have 7 to 10 payers that they deal with just on an annual basis. So that's a lot of different expectations and a lot of different programs that they're working to align within their clinic, and especially those smaller providers and those independent providers having to deal with 7 to 10 providers, and a lot of them have more than 10. And so if you're dealing with one program like NextGen, if you're just having to focus your efforts in one area, you really it's hard, but it's not that difficult. But when you're having to deal with a Humana and a United, and I'm picking on the people that were on the panel before, and everyone has their own program and they all want to work with you and with good intention, and then you also have the government programs that come in that you want to do. How do you do all of it? And how do you make that work?
Well, I guess,
that's a $1 million question, right?
So one thing that comes to mind specifically are quality metrics. And at UNC, we looked across all our contracts. We have 183 quality metrics to manage, and you can imagine that that is not realistic. And so we went through this exercise of assessing the quality metrics in terms of their relative clinical value, how do they align with contracts, et cetera. And we identified the top 20. There's actually 20 metrics that make the most difference, right? This 80-20 rule, and everything after that's diminishing returns. And again, aligning around those metrics, payer agnostic, what's the biggest return in terms of outcomes and finances is one example.
You know, there's the external party alignment piece, which is often the payer relationship, but I think due diligence on internal malalignment is also critical to do this sort of work. So we have physicians that are compensated differently based on productivity versus quality and so forth. And so under those circumstances, you can see how you can get institutional or internal malalignment. And it goes beyond compensation as well. Understanding where there is that lack of agreement or alignment, I think, is critical, and then finding a way to overcome that. It's hard to go to a payer and say, okay, do it this way, if you can't execute internally on the way that you requested.
And Deb, that was absolutely perfect. Our approach is very much like that. We have clients in 40 states, and so we touch virtually every payer, every type of thing that you can possibly do, government, otherwise. And it does get extremely tricky, especially when you're trying to put together bundles from different payers, because everyone's got a different design. They've got the short-term ones, they've got site of service ones, plus and minus, minus 40 days, minus 15 days from a date of admission or a date of procedure. It could be anything from 5 days, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days post whatever discharge is. And you have to kind of manage all of that. And you're right, if you don't have the initial alignment, it doesn't matter what you're going to do. You need to have all of that put together and understand what those parameters are. We try to link them as best as we can, because fundamentally to operate these is not different. It's the little nuances that get in the way, and so can you minimize some of the nuances? And so that you're kind of doing the same thing. Ideally, if we were in a utopian spot, we'd be doing the same thing for every patient regardless of what the payer is. The real trick is, how do you convince everybody to actually do that, and how do they believe that they're getting properly compensated for that so that it doesn't seem like they're giving everything away?
Yeah, for us, we operate 21 different value-based arrangements today in order to get to 300,000 lives. So again, Iowa's small, relatively speaking. The way that we've done and looked at this over the years is, as our portfolio's grown, is to try to find that commonality, to really set up that standard process from a care management perspective, to support our providers as part of that continuum. And the way in which we've done that is through our governance. So we actually have one board that oversees our 5 Medicare programs today through a management services agreement. With that, we have seven regions that all have standard governance and councils and for care management, for analytics, for clinical measures, that all operate and support all of those different value-based arrangements. So we do try to find commonality amongst those payer contracts, and so we have 59 measures across those various agreements that we're actually compensated on. And we've really boiled it down in our physician executive council, really has boiled it down to what are the 7 things that we need to do well, understanding there's many things that we can try to do, but what are the things that we need to focus on? And so those are actually 7 measures that we report on monthly to our various governance councils, and we're monitoring daily at various points across the continuum.
Can I just add one other quick comment? And to the extent that your alignment develops standard processes or maybe the one way to do something, it's absolutely critical to stick to that and not deviate, because I think you end up, once you start having erosion from agreed to processes that give you that internal alignment, you go back to the wild, wild west that you initially had. And I think that's sometimes the hardest thing to do. The larger the organization, the more diverse, the more complex, the harder it is to sometimes mandate things being done a particular way. But if you don't have that, you'll be right back where you started in 12 to 24 months.
So let's shift the conversation a little bit and let's start talking about risk. So how do you know when you're ready for risk? Specifically, downside risk.
I think that's one of the more difficult things to actually address. We see it in BPCI, which is our biggest cadre of clients. That's a downside risk program. The question is, who's taking the risk? One of the reasons that practices and even hospitals join in with the convener is so that they can limit their risk profile. Risk tolerance is part of it, and you have to really assess. We go through an assessment of clients, whether they're a physician group practice, hospital system, it doesn't make a difference. In terms of identifying what is their risk tolerance, what is their ability to recognize change. Some of them are more able to accept risk? And some of this is built on infrastructure. Do they have the capacity to take on the risk that is necessary? When we work with physician group practices, we have practices that are the onesies and twosies docs up to 150, 160, 250 docs in the practice. Obviously, depending on size, their risk tolerance intuitively should be different. In reality, not necessarily, because each doc that's a member of that and is an owner in that PGP has their individual risk tolerance, and that tends to fall back to be no different than the onesies and twosies. And so you really need to kind of make that assessment and figure out how you can best handle risk and work with them and how do you structure the right model in a value-based care system that they can best engage in. Because the ultimate goal for most of these, whether, at least from the way we see this, from a PGP's perspective and ACH perspective, it's not necessarily the bottom line that can be generated from the model that you're in. It's rather the experience that you gain for what is a new payment model going forward that counts. Yes, there's the opportunity for a windfall, if you will, a working windfall. That is the bottom line, but that's a period of time. When it becomes a payment model, what you want to do is be experienced so that you can handle that, because if you're not experienced in it, then you will be shocked, and then the question is, can you actually manage anything?
All right, I'll go next. When do you know you're ready? Still trying to wait for that answer. But in one way that we've looked at it is to, doing this since 2012, we have a lot of data and information around our members that are going to come into the program, and that's only as good as the data that you get. One example is, the information that you don't receive from such things as the Medicare Shared Savings Program with substance abuse information. It's a little bit of a blind spot, if you will. But the way that we've looked at this in order to mitigate our downside risk as we go into these programs is to look at what is the upside associated with things like MACRA. So going into an enhanced APM, obviously there's benefits in order to increase the upside, but also that downside potential. So one way that we've looked at it is what is the actual upside relative to that AAPM payment? And then as we go out and work with independent groups, it's a conversation to say, what would your AAPM upside be as well? And can we put a portion of that at risk to move you into this trajectory of an enhanced APM? And stagger that so that they always end up actually ahead in our organization, assuming any marginal downside that we can do with modeling. So we've used that as a catalyst to change the market and actually have a number of independent groups actually come into the Medicare Shared Savings Program with us, as well as other advanced APMs that are entering our market as well.
For us, it was similar in terms of thinking through MACRA, and embarking on the next gen is our first step. We did look at that as an investment in learning. At UNC, there's quite a bit of rigor and domain expertise in working with clinical data. Can't say that about the world of claims. And so, we just needed to kind of jump into it in order to start learning and getting that claims data, and then understanding the population. Say a learning is coding really matters greatly in any arrangement, and that became very apparent to us in Next Gen. As we enter commercial contracts, we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of our population, that we don't embark on risk in year one, so it is always graduated, phased in risk over time. And there are a lot of things to consider, like benefit design. If it's an exclusive narrow network with minimal leakage, gatekeeper type product, that we look at that one way versus complete open access where we have significant leakage and can't necessarily manage all of that risk. The other piece is curating our provider network. So as we get into this, getting claims data from payers that really help us understand the relative performance of our providers, and we're taking steps to curate that so that we can get to a place where we continue to improve that network. And then lastly, it's also the care management infrastructure. It's everything that makes a difference in terms of the lives of patients and how we care for them, and that needs to mature over time. And we have areas where we're doing exceptionally well, and then areas where we need to make improvements. And we work off of portfolio of various initiatives. Think of them as, levers relative to the contracts that we're signing on for. And then lastly, the other piece is looking forward based on our kind of lines of business to say, if we were to convert our contracts, what would that look like, and set targets for ourselves so that we can pace ourselves and actually have a roadmap, a blueprint to execute against.
These are all great answers, and I'm actually going to take back all of them and apply them to what we're doing. It's probably not been obvious, but just to kind of show you how collaborative this kind of work needs to be, our primary competitor for Duke Health in North Carolina is UNC. And so I'm just taking trade secrets down right now. I don't think you can really ever know you're ready for risk, because if you're successful in one contract, it's only one contract, it's a particular population and so forth. So to be able to say you did it for 3 patients, 3% of your population, that you can do it for 100, it's a bit of a leap. But at some point you need to take a little bit of that leap. I will go back to what Mariah said earlier, which is digging your heels in is probably not a good long-term strategy. We've seen what's happened with CMS and Medicare and the way they want to move individuals and providers to risk. Our market in North Carolina in 12 months flipped. About 75% of the patients in a state of 10 million, or residents in a state of 10 million, by some estimates, are going to be in an APM or VBC arrangement. So if you want to continue to be a growth-oriented, viable provider in that space, you got to be ready to take risk. And so I think the idea that you build experience through small disciplined experiments, pilots, and so forth is the right strategy moving forward. But at some point you may find yourself having to go in head first because of what the market is doing.
I don't think those bells are for us. So something you said kind of sparked a question that I hadn't floated out to you guys before, so get ready. So when we talk about risk, I think about cost and about total cost of care and about getting the data from different plans and from all these different sources about, as a primary care provider, how much my specialist costs that I'm sending my patient to, and how much the facility costs that I'm sending my patient to, and this MRI versus that MRI. And can you talk a little bit about that information, how you get it, how you communicate it to your providers, and how to best use that to help with with the total cost, but also with the risk that they're taking on, and how important that information is.
I'm happy to go. I think one of the areas where claims data are actually perhaps helpful. And while we're all trying to figure out actually how to use claims data in an effective way, at the end of the day, when the payers do their reconciliation, they're going to use those numbers to determine if you are above benchmark or below benchmark. So it's a good place to kind of say, we may not have perfect data, but this is good enough. The challenge is getting at a level of granularity that then allows you to use those data in a way that either says we're going to do more of one thing or less of another thing. So I think that the ability to take those data and share them with the provider at the individual level is a bit of a challenge, but claims data are a good place to start. Finding a way to then marry your claims data to your clinical data, I think, is really the real opportunity. At the end of the day, it's really about how you practice, and I'll give you a great example. Most payers will use data, let's use MRIs per 1,000, and then they'll be able to map it back to a primary care provider. And so you can say, hey, let's compare all of our PCPs, let's even say, let's compare all of our family doctors and say, who is in the sweet spot of ordering MRIs per 1,000, who's an outlier, and who's maybe a top performer. When you go back to those data, you realize it's actually not the family doctor that's ordering those MRIs. It's the specialist that you send that the family doctor may or may not send the patient to. It could have happened in the inpatient setting and so forth. So there are those sort of limitations to data. I think the real risk is when you share that with providers and they're able to come back and give you caveats that then minimize, you've lost a tremendous amount of credibility. So we've been incredibly cautious about putting performance data in front of providers if we don't have good confidence around the data and that there's something then they can do about that.
Yeah, that was perfectly put. We get data from all kinds of sources. How many people have dealt with ResDAC or standard analytical files from CMS?
Yep.
Not many. That may not be, that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not quite sure. It's interestingly enough, when people think about CMS, they think about, you know, difficulty and bureaucracy and whatnot. Their data is so much cleaner than any of the plan data. It's remarkable. And to the same point that Dev was making, when you start to look at this data, even in the claims data, you don't necessarily have the info on who ordered what. What you've got is the providers, if they give it to you. You've got claims, and you know what they are, but you don't know necessarily the order of events that happened and who was the driver of various costs. And that's an important one, because you're right, because then when you go back to the provider, you're trying to figure out what is it that I tell them.
Yeah, I completely agree. That is hard to make those inferences. We provide our practices with information. It's actually scorecards that reflect their total cost of care, you know, against benchmark, as well as KPIs, focus on utilization, and then patient drill down data. And the KPI data is unblinded, so the entire SIN gets to see how everybody performs. And, you know, that's helpful in terms of building an awareness of cost, but we have so much more work to do in terms of the specialty arena, and like everyone was saying, Deb, and connecting these dots and making it meaningful. So we too are incredibly cautious of putting that out there, because to your point, like that's the fastest way to lose credibility. So it's a very stepwise approach.
Yeah, we've been, I think, through an evolution on this one as well, and it's probably indicative of our compensation models, because we pushed out a lot of data. We're, you know, fortunate we have a lot of EMRs, but we also have a lot of claims files, and we have all that data now in one place, and over, you know, multi-year project to do that, which you quickly get into analysis paralysis, right? What data do you push out? What data is good? What data is going to have the right conversation? And we've gone through that to the point now where we're really looking at, again, 7 measures, because it's what people can manage to, aligned to where we can get good quality information to our providers, so that you know, it's not necessarily that's not my patient kind of thing, but really around the specialty area is we're starting to drive a conversation with bringing specialists now into our downside risk programs, where they have some skin in the game, to start to have a conversation, use the data to have a conversation. So we can push out a lot of data and information, but if there's not a conversation to go with it, it's not as good as, you know, it's good as what it's printed on, and it's not really valuable. So for us, we're very cautiously going down this path once again, to make sure that it's meaningful information and there's a conversation to go with it, so that we actually do get some action, and it's not just you know, thrown in the recycling bin.
So I'm going to make an editorial comment as the moderator. For primary care providers in the room, do we have primary care providers in the room? Those that manage primary care providers. If you're going to judge me on total cost of care, I need that data. Yeah, moving on. So let's talk about shared savings. So we've talked about, you know, we have these contracts and, you know, the potential windfall, winning the lottery 18 months later. How do you arrange to get that money into the hands of the people doing the work? Because we hear from members all the time that it's not happening well.
Well, I'll start at the end of the table. We'll go this way first. In the programs and the models that we see done, it varies depending on how the model is structured. So in BPCI, if you were in the classic version, which is the one that was the first 5 years that ended in September of 18, it was a very structured distribution, and it was governed by CMS. You could only share, as a sharing option, 50% of the fee-for-service rate that a provider billed. And so if you're talking about an orthopod who did a total hip replacement, they may have billed $1,300, $1,400. You could share, they could earn an additional $700 if there were savings to share. Now, it is technically not a shared savings program, and that's a good caveat, unlike an MSSP ACO. But the concept of gain shares is not technically different. In the current iteration of BPCI, there are no limitations. That 50% cap rule was removed after much trepidation, and CMS chose to go from one end of the totem pole off the other diving board on the other side and get rid of it completely without, and there were lots of, I won't go into the technical reasons for that. That opened up a gambit to and all kinds of flexibility, so it really depends on what the model is. A lot of them choose whatever their comp model is. to start with. Now, it's more difficult as for those clients that we have that are ACHs, because then they start to run into the work RVU type thing and what the RVUs are and what their compensation models are to start with, and can I do this? And there's a whole bunch of legal components to this that I certainly do not wish to get into. When you think about some of the other versions that go on in the ACO world, then you have to start to think about who am I? So if you're a primary care driven ACO, which is most of them, usually the primary care docs will have a shared savings based on some model, and you ACO folk can kind of cover that territory. I think the outstanding question is, do they do any sharing with the downstream specialist at all if they have them, whether they're part of the ACO or not, because they interact with the same patient population? And I think that's where you get the they are and they are not type question. There's an obverse to this. If a PGP is the driving force behind, let's say, a bundle payment program, and they have a distribution of funds because they're incurring savings, do they share back with anyone who isn't themselves either, whether it be an ACH or a post-acute care provider? In some cases, the answer is yes, and in many cases, the answer is also no. And so it's kind of a two-way street with the same issues.
Yeah, for us, so we have 7 different markets that are widely different, 7 urban centers in Iowa, if you can believe it. And with, thank you. And so what we bounce up against is just really general market dynamics. Do we employ a majority of the providers where they have a more of a line model with their existing incentive programs, or do we have a predominantly independent region as well, so they're not employed? And those models differ based on what we call our chapter distribution charter. So majority of our markets, though, have first dollar savings today. Again, as I shared, we're in the midst of trying to figure out how do we align the right measures, the right incentives to the behaviors. And for those markets where we're 100% employed, as an example, it aligns differently. It aligns to their existing incentive programs that are as part of their provider contract, because you bump up against things like fair market value. So we've taken, rather than 10 things that you have to do to get your incentive program, and really tried to align them to, here are the 10 things, 10 things for the incentive program, 10 things for value-based, and really tried to boil it down to say, what are the 5 things that they need to do to achieve their incentive distribution. So we've taken a market-by-market approach, and we're really trying to learn from our partners across the state, for those that are independent, and some of which also have their own health plan. So we're really collaborative in nature with our provider organizations to make sure that we get that right.
I'd say for UNC that we are still very much learning in our 3rd performance year right now, at least with NextGen, and year 2 with some other contracts. Our guiding principle and policy states that the majority of savings need to land in the hands of PCPs. In terms of specialists, there's a small allocation for a specialist pool to fund pilot work, but that really, out of the gate, it's fueling primary care. On the employee side, it's a little bit challenging because it's like running that race, and you just are about to cross the finish line, and you stop and you make that payment at the TIN level, and then it's the TIN that gets to distribute how they see fit. And so we have work to do to make sure that that last mile is covered. Different on the independent practice side, because they really have an opportunity to see that direct connection, although the timing is an issue, because by the time you get through, and if you have a reconciliation period with a payer and you want to challenge something, it could be up to 2 years before you can actually distribute savings, and it's really hard to make that mental connection. We're asking you to do X, but you're not seeing that reward until 2 years out.
Yeah, I would agree with all my co-panelists. I think you need a shared savings model that's transparent, easy to understand with simple math. Is it attribution? Is it pool? Are you pro-routing some providers versus others? It's also always a good opportunity to talk about any shared losses arrangements that you may have, because I've found that now that we've gone two-sided, we've had some shared losses agreements that we agreed to years ago, but because we were only in one-sided models, no one was paying attention to those. But now that those are becoming reality, it's amazing. A handful of people say, well, I don't remember agreeing on that when you have shared losses. So I think it's really important that if you're going to talk about shared savings, the path to two-sided risk is getting shorter and shorter. So understanding how you're going to distribute shared losses as well is an important conversation.
So we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. Any questions from the floor?
My name's Mark Pfizer. I'm from Cape Valley, North Carolina, and nice to see you up there.
Yeah.
Have you found in your progression towards APM and downside risk, as the more mature the model gets, that you're able to get the payer to reduce the pressure of the administrative burden of carrying out the program? Like we're asking the PCPs to carry a whole portion of this, yet there's still the administrative rules of auth requirements and all those components. Is there any ground that you can pick up as you get further
Yeah,
down that line?
it's a really good question. So the payers all state that they are very willing to back off of some of these administrative requirements in exchange for the healthcare system taking on more risk, right? Professional risk. And given that it's the risk they're taking on is graduated, we still sort of live in that kind of traditional managed care world. It won't be until the providers take on substantive risk that they will be willing to back off of that. But that is in writing, in the works. We're just not there yet.
I also think that it's understandable that the payers have a little bit of inflexibility because they're trying to replicate the same model in multiple markets. And so if you want to make nuanced changes to your agreement, it may not make business sense, at least at that stage and point. So I've found that joint operating committees and a willingness to meet on a regular basis is a good path to get to that endpoint. But in our experience is largely the same, that when you're ready to take on more risk, some of those barriers that you have today will go away.
Any other questions?
I'll add one element to that because we haven't talked about it, and it would be a way too big a discussion for this, but the thought between retrospective programs and prospective programs, because prospective programs, especially when you talk about bundles, are something that could alleviate a lot of that burden and the risk component because it's predefined and you know exactly what it is. They're difficult from the payer side often to do, which is why they failed when CMS did this several years ago in BPCI. But are they impossible? The answer is absolutely no. It's just a matter of construction, and can you work on it so that the payer can actually not have to be the one adjudicating stuff, because that was their biggest issue. Their claim systems don't adjudicate those.
Any other questions from the floor? Okay, well, I'm going to take that as a wrap, and I'm going to thank our panel for your expertise and for sharing your thoughts with us.